Leonard Carter had become a billionaire. He had built his empire from nothing, from the particular hunger of a man who grew up watching his mother stretch every coin across every week and promised himself, very quietly and very early, that he would one day make that stop. He had kept that promise. It had taken 9 years and every version of himself he had been willing to sacrifice along the way. But he had kept it. The company, the contracts, the 31 people whose livelihoods depended on his decisions every morning. The black Mercedes waiting at every airport. The suit that fit the way suits fit when they are made for you specifically and not pulled off a rack. He had built all of it from the ground up, from nothing, from the dust road and the compound and the cracked walls and the leaking roof of the house where his mother still lived. And now, finally, he was going home. He had planned every detail of the return the way he planned everything, carefully, completely, with attention paid to what the moment deserved. The car. The gift in the bag on the back seat. The things he had been rehearsing saying to his mother for years. The words that had been waiting in him like water behind a wall. Ready the moment he finally stood in front of her face to face. He was going to walk through that door and tell her it was over, the hard years, the long mornings, the stretching and managing and doing without. He was going to tell her that her prayers had been answered and that everything she had ever sacrificed for him had been worth it and then some. He had been carrying that moment for 9 years. But Leonard Carter had no idea what was actually waiting for him behind that door. He was not prepared for his mother's face. Not the joy he had rehearsed receiving, but something older and heavier, something carrying 9 years of a weight he had never been told about. He was not prepared for the compound that felt smaller than memory, or the photograph on the wall, or the particular quality of the late afternoon light on the dust road that made everything look both exactly right and terribly, irreversibly overdue. And he was not prepared for the boy. There are moments in a person's life that divide everything that came before from everything that comes after. Moments where the ground does not shake. It simply stops being the ground you thought it was. Leonard Carter was about to have one of those moments. Standing in the doorway of his mother's worn and weathered house, in the last light of a Friday afternoon, he would look down and find a 9-year-old boy looking back up at him. And those eyes, those large, still, patient eyes, would take everything Leonard had spent 9 years building and show him, in the space of a single breath, exactly what it had cost. This is that story. Hello friends and welcome. Before we go any further, please take 2 seconds right now to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. And drop a comment telling us where you are watching from today. Are you in Texas, Georgia, Florida, maybe London, Toronto, South Africa, or Jamaica? We want to know who is here with us. Now let us get into it. The heat came before the sun. By the time the sky outside had turned from black to the deep gray that comes just before dawn, Rebecca Carter was already moving through her kitchen. Not quickly, not loudly, but with the particular steadiness of a woman whose body has long since memorized the shape of its own survival. She did not need the light. Her hands found the matchbox on the second shelf. They found the pot. They found the small bag of cornmeal she kept tied at the top so nothing spilled in the night. Her hands knew this kitchen the way they knew everything she had spent years doing without anyone watching. Completely, and without needing to be told. Those hands told their own story without words. The knuckles were raised and dry. The skin across the palms was calloused at the base of every finger. The left wrist had a swelling in the joint that had been worsening for 2 years, a swelling Rebecca mentioned to no one because there was no one to mention it to, and even if there had been, what would saying it change? The stirring still had to happen. The boy still had to eat before school. Rebecca Carter was 65 years old. She had not had a single morning off in 9 years. Not one. 9 years of rising before the compound woke up. 9 years of cooking before the light changed, of packing the boy's lunch the night before so the mornings could move faster, of walking him 4 blocks to the school gate in the early heat with his backpack on her shoulder because it was too heavy for him and she did not believe in letting a child carry more weight than his years could reasonably hold. 9 years of running her market stall 3 mornings a week, tomatoes, peppers, small packets of spice on a folding table under a blue canopy that had been patched in one corner with a strip of different colored material and had been that way for 3 years. 9 years of counting what came in against what had to go out with the concentration of a woman who has never once been in a position to waste anything. The blood pressure tablets on the shelf above the sink should have been refilled 6 days ago. She had been stretching them to every other day this week because the market had been slow and the money had already been allocated before it arrived. The boy needed new exercise books. The back room ceiling needed more than the plastic bowl she positioned beneath the leak when the rains came. One thing at a time. It was always one thing at a time and had been for 9 years, and would continue to be until something changed. She moved to the small room off the main hall and checked what she had laid out the night before. Daniel's school uniform hung on the nail beside the window. Shirt pressed with the iron she heated on the stove because the electric one had stopped working in March. Trousers folded along the crease. Shoes on the floor beneath with the laces already loosened. She had learned, across 9 years of mornings, which battles could be afforded and which could not. The uniform was not one of them. If the clothes were ready, the morning ran smoother. If the morning ran smoother, the boy arrived at school on time. Every small thing connected to the next in a chain that Rebecca had built and maintained through the stubborn, unglamorous, daily labor of a woman who understood that survival is not a single dramatic act. It is 10,000 quiet ones, repeated without applause. She went back to the kitchen and began wrapping the bread for the stall. She was folding the last piece of cloth when she heard him. Daniel appeared in the doorway the way he always did in the mornings. Quietly, already fully dressed, school shoes on, laces done in the double knot she had taught him. He sat at the table without being asked and picked up his spoon and began eating with the focused, unhurried attention of a child who takes small things seriously. Rebecca watched him for a moment from the counter. The line of his jaw. The way he held himself straight without being reminded. The quality of his morning silence, which was not the silence of a child with nothing going on, but the silence of a child who preferred to observe before he spoke. She turned back to the bread. That was when she noticed the spoon had stopped. She turned around. Daniel was standing in front of the photograph on the wall. He had risen from the table without her hearing him, which he did. Appeared in places the way thoughts appear, without warning or announcement. He was standing very still, his head tilted slightly, looking at the face of the man in the photograph with an expression that was different this morning. Not the usual brief curiosity that passed in a moment. Something longer. Something that had a question inside it that was getting too large to remain unspoken. The photograph showed a young man. Broad-shouldered, shirt open at the collar, a watch on his wrist. Caught mid-wave by whoever was holding the camera. Grinning the way people grin when they believe everything good is still ahead of them. Rebecca had lived with that photograph on the wall for 9 years. She had walked past it every day. She had stopped being able to look at it directly somewhere around year 3. Her hand tightened on the bread she was holding. Daniel turned and looked at her. Directly, steadily, with those eyes that had never, for a single day of 9 years, belonged to anyone's side of anything but one. And what he said next stopped every sound in the room. "Grandma," he said. "That man in the photo called last night." I picked up the phone. He said his name is Leonard. He said he's coming home. Rebecca did not move for 3 full seconds. The bread was still in her hand. The stove was still on. Outside, the compound was making its ordinary sounds as though the floor had not just shifted beneath her feet. She stood at the counter and looked at her grandson and felt something move through her chest that she had not felt in 9 years. Cold and fast and with absolutely nowhere to go. He called. Leonard called. And Daniel had answered. She set the bread down carefully, the way you set something down when your hands are not entirely steady and you do not want anyone to notice. Then she turned to face him fully. Daniel was still standing by the photograph, watching her with those large, still eyes. And it struck her, not for the first time but more sharply than usual, how much those eyes did not belong to her side of anything. "When?" she said. Her voice came out even. She had spent a long time learning to make her voice come out even. "Last night," Daniel said. "After you fell asleep. The phone rang and I thought it might be Auntie Grace, so I picked it up." A pause. He sounded surprised when I answered. He asked who I was. I told him my name. Another pause, shorter. "He went very quiet, Grandma. Like the kind of quiet that isn't a connection problem." Rebecca pulled out a chair and sat down. Not because she wanted to sit, but because her legs had decided the conversation was going to require it. This was the thing about Daniel that undid her sometimes. He was 9 years old. He should have been thinking about football and whether it was too hot for his school jumper. Instead, he stood there describing the quality of a man's silence over a phone line with the precision of someone 3 times his age. He had always been like this. From the time he was small enough to fit in the crook of her arm, he had watched the world with the careful attention of a child who understood, at some level beneath language, that there were things happening around him that he had not yet been given the full story of. He did not ask questions the way other children did, loudly and repeatedly until something arrived. Daniel asked a question once, watched your face while you answered, and stored everything he noticed. The pause before you spoke, the way your eyes moved, the thing your hands did when your mouth was saying something your body was not entirely sure about. He stored all of it and said nothing, and Rebecca had been on the receiving end of that particular patience more times than she was comfortable admitting. He came and sat across from her now, folding his hands on the table in a gesture so like her own that something in her throat closed briefly. "Who is he?" Daniel asked, quietly, directly. Rebecca looked at her grandson, at the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the particular stillness he carried that had never come from her and had never come from Simone. She had looked at this boy every single day for 9 years, and every day the answer to his question had been written plainly on his face for anyone who knew where to look. "He is someone I have not spoken to in a long time," she said carefully. "Someone who used to live in this house." Daniel nodded slowly, accepting the answer as temporary rather than final. "Is he coming back?" he asked. "He said on the phone that he was coming home. He said soon." "I know," Rebecca said, though she had not known until 30 seconds ago. "Do you want him to?" Daniel asked. And that was the question. The one with no prepared answer, because she had spent 9 years praying Leonard would come back and 9 years dreading the moment he did. And both of those things were entirely and simultaneously true, and she had never once found a way to hold them both without one of them cutting her. "Finish your porridge," she said. "You'll be late." Daniel looked at her for one long moment. Then he picked up his spoon. But that night, long after Rebecca had tucked him in and turned off the light and pulled his door to its usual gap, Daniel lay on his back in the narrow bed staring at the ceiling with his hands folded on his chest. The compound was quiet. The drip in the back room had started again, patient and steady. He thought about the man's voice on the phone, the way it had gone completely silent when Daniel said his name. Not a bad silence. Not an angry one. The silence of someone who has just received information that has rearranged something fundamental inside them and needs a moment before they can speak again. And he thought about something he had never told his grandmother. Something he had been carrying alone for 3 weeks, turning over and over in the quiet of his own mind the way you turn a stone to see what is living beneath it. He had seen the name on the money transfer receipts. The ones Rebecca kept tucked in the Bible on the top shelf, the shelf she believed he could not reach. He had been reaching it since he was 7 years old. The name on every single receipt, every month, without exception, for as long as the records went back. Leonard Carter. The same last name as his own. To understand what Leonard coming home meant, you first had to understand what Leonard leaving had looked like. Go back 9 years. To an evening in the dry season when the compound still smelled of the dinner Rebecca had cooked and the sky outside had turned the particular shade of orange that only holds for 12 minutes before the dark takes over. Leonard was 26 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a cup of tea he was not drinking, with the look of a man who had been rehearsing something all day and was only now finally ready to say it out loud. Rebecca had known something was coming. She always knew. Not through information but through 26 years of attention, through knowing specifically how this person's shoulders carried tension, and the exact quality of his silences when something large was sitting inside them. She sat across from him and she waited. "There's an opportunity," Leonard said. He said it carefully, like a man placing something fragile on a surface he is not sure will hold it. "Construction work. Overseas. The money is," he stopped. Started again. "Mama, the money is real. The kind of real that changes things. Not month-to-month changes. Everything changes. The roof. The bills. All of it." Rebecca looked at her son, at his hands around the cup, at the tension across his jaw, at the hope in his eyes fighting with guilt and losing narrowly. She had watched this boy grow up in this house and watched him watch her work and carry and manage, and she had seen what it had done to him, the particular quiet shame of a good man who wants to help and cannot yet find the means to do it. She understood why he was sitting there with this proposition and this desperate hope. She also understood things he did not know she understood. That distance is easier to promise across than to cross. That a year has a way of becoming two. That success, when it finally arrives, brings its own gravity, pulling a person forward and forward until looking back requires an effort the momentum of living does not always allow. She knew all of this, and she said nothing about any of it. "How long?" she asked. "A year," Leonard said. "Maybe less. I'll send money every month. I'll call every week. And when I come back," his voice dropped half a register, "I'll fix everything. All of it. I promise you that." Rebecca looked at the water stain above the doorframe that had been spreading slowly for 2 years. Then she looked back at her son. "Okay," she said, just that one word. Not because she had nothing else to say. She had a great deal else to say. But Leonard was 26 and hungry and tired in the specific way that young people get tired when they can feel their potential pressing against the walls of their circumstances, and she had not raised him to be kept small by her fear. So she folded everything she felt into the deep quiet place where she kept most things too large and sharp to leave out in the open. And she said okay. She cooked his favorite meal the night before he left. Jollof rice, fried plantain, cold ginger drink the way he had been asking for it since he was 12. They ate together at the table without talking much, which was its own kind of conversation, the kind that does not need words because both people already understand what is being said. In the morning a car came. Leonard put his 2 bags in the back. Then he turned and held his mother for a long time. Longer than he usually did, long enough that she felt his chest move with something he did not let become a sound. She pressed her hand flat against his back the way she had done when he was small and something had frightened him. "A year," he said into her shoulder. "I promise." "I know," she said. She stood on the step and watched the car go down the dust road until there was nothing left to watch. Then she stood a while longer, looking at the empty road and the settling dust and the ordinary morning sky. Then she went inside and started the day. She did not know that 8 months later a young woman would appear at that same door carrying a newborn baby boy, and that the year Leonard had promised would quietly, without announcement, become 9. But there was something else Rebecca did not know. Something that would not surface until years later, when Daniel was old enough to search for things on his own. Something that explained why Leonard's hands had not been entirely steady that evening around that cup of tea. Why his shoulders had carried a different weight. Not just the tension of a man preparing to leave, but the tension of a man preparing to leave because of something he had already done and did not know how to face. Leonard had not left only for the construction job. He had left because of Simone. It was a Thursday afternoon, 8 months after Leonard's car disappeared down the dust road, when Rebecca heard the knock. She was not expecting anyone, and the knock had a particular quality, tentative, as though the person on the other side was not entirely certain they had the right to be there. Rebecca opened the door. The young woman on her step was perhaps 22, perhaps younger. It was difficult to tell because her face carried the worn quality of someone who had not slept properly in weeks and had been carrying something far heavier than her frame was built for. She was thin in the way that is not chosen. Her dress was clean but had been washed too many times. And pressed against her chest, wrapped in a length of printed cloth that had once been blue and was now something closer to gray, was a baby. Small. Sleeping. One tiny fist curled against the young woman's collarbone. "Mrs. Carter," the young woman said. Her voice was steady but only just. "My name is Simone. I knew Leonard. I got this address from a friend of a friend. I didn't know where else to come." Rebecca looked at her. Then she looked at the baby. She did not speak yet. Simone took that silence as permission, and once she started it came out the way things come out when they have been held in too long. Not in order, not neatly, but in the compressed rush of someone who has been waiting for a safe place to finally set something down. The relationship with Leonard, brief and ended badly before she knew she was pregnant. The pregnancy she had managed alone because she had no one to tell. The birth that had been difficult, for days in a hospital, a bill she could not pay. The weeks after, in a single room she could no longer afford, with a child who cried through the night and a body that had not recovered and a family whose door was simply closed to this particular situation. The slow, terrible narrowing of options until there was only one address left on any list she could construct. This one. Rebecca listened to all of it without interrupting. She stood in the doorway and received this young woman's truth quietly, and with the full attention she gave to everything that mattered. When Simone finished, the silence lasted only a moment. Then Rebecca looked at the baby. She looked at his face the way she had looked at Leonard's face 26 years ago in a hospital room, with the complete and undivided attention of a woman taking inventory of something that matters beyond measure. The baby was sleeping, his mouth slightly open, his small chest rising and falling with the uncomplicated confidence of a person who does not yet know enough about the world to be afraid of it. Rebecca looked at the line of his brow, the particular architecture of his jaw, still soft with newness but already carrying something. A structure she recognized the way you recognize a melody you have not heard in years but have never once forgotten. Her chest did something she did not let reach her face. She looked up at Simone, at this young woman holding herself together with what appeared to be the very last thread of her composure. Eyes bright and terrified and ashamed all at the same time. "Come inside," Rebecca said. "Both of you." She made tea. She found a blanket for the baby. She gave Simone the chair closest to the window because it caught the evening breeze and the girl looked like she needed air. She moved around the kitchen with the same quiet steadiness she brought to everything and did not ask Simone to explain anything further because everything necessary had already been said. That night, after Simone had fallen asleep in the spare room with the baby tucked against her side, Rebecca sat at the kitchen table alone. The compound was quiet. The candle burned low. She held her phone in both hands, Leonard's name on the screen, her thumb resting over the call button. She sat like that for a long time. Then she set the phone down. What she did not know, what she could not have known sitting in that quiet kitchen with the candle guttering, was that the reason Leonard had never mentioned Simone had nothing to do with the relationship meaning nothing. It was because he had ended it to protect a secret of his own. A secret that had nothing to do with work or money or construction jobs across the ocean. A secret that would eventually reach Rebecca not through Leonard, but through a folded piece of paper pressed into her hand at this same doorway 7 years later by a young woman who had finally decided that someone in this family needed to know the full truth. The first year was the hardest, and Rebecca had lived through enough hard years to know that was saying something. Daniel was not an easy infant. He did not sleep in long stretches. He was alert in the way that some babies are alert from the very beginning, eyes tracking movement and light and faces with an attention that seemed too organized for a person his size. He cried with intention rather than randomly, which sounds like a mercy but is not, because intentional crying means something specific is always wrong and you are always responsible for finding out what. Rebecca found out. Night after night, in the blue dark quiet of the compound when Simone was asleep and the baby was not, Rebecca walked the narrow hallway with Daniel against her shoulder, one hand supporting his head, the other pressed firm and warm against his back, and she walked until he settled and her feet ached and the sky began its slow turn toward gray. She did not complain. You identified what needed doing. You did it. You got up the next morning and did it again. Simone tried. Rebecca believed that then, and she believed it still years later, when believing it had become more complicated. In those first months Simone was present in the consuming, frightened way of a young mother who loves her child completely and is simultaneously terrified that love alone will not be sufficient. She held Daniel for hours. She learned his sounds. She sat with Rebecca in the evenings asking questions, and Rebecca answered every one without making her feel small for not knowing the answers. But something in Simone was not anchored. Rebecca could see it. In the way Simone sometimes looked at the door, or went quiet mid-sentence, or came back from the market with her eyes carrying something she had not left with. There was a life pulling at her from somewhere outside this compound, outside this arrangement. Rebecca did not judge her for it. She had been 22 herself once, and she remembered what it felt like to have the future pressing against the present like something that will not wait. The gaps began in the 7th month. A day here, 2 days there. The gaps grew wider. A week, then 10 days. Simone called shorter calls, her voice carrying the careful brightness of someone trying to sound more together than they were. Rebecca gave her honest reports. Daniel had pulled himself upright against the chair. He had made a sound that was almost a word. He had laughed for the first time at the shadow of Rebecca's hand on the wall. And she heard Simone go quiet on the other end in the way people go quiet when something is hurting them that they have decided not to say out loud. Daniel took his first steps on a Tuesday morning when he was 11 months old. Rebecca was the only one there to see it. 3 unsteady steps from the chair to the table, his arms out at his sides, his face locked in an expression of total concentration that would become his signature for the rest of his life. Rebecca knelt on the floor and held out her hands and said his name, and he walked to her. She held him against her chest and stayed very still for a moment. Then she got up and started lunch. The morning Simone left for the last time, she kissed Daniel on the forehead while he was eating. He was 2 years old, entirely absorbed in his porridge, and he looked up briefly and then looked back down. Simone stood at the door with her bag over her shoulder and looked across the room at Rebecca. "I'll call," she said. "Okay," Rebecca said. She called once 3 weeks later. She did not call again. And as Rebecca folded Daniel's small shirt that evening, she felt the truth settle into her bones with the quiet permanence of something that was never going to be undone. It was just the two of them now. It was going to be the two of them from here forward. But there was something Rebecca had told no one, not a single living soul across 9 years. Because at that door, in the moment before Simone walked away for the last time, she had pressed a small folded piece of paper into Rebecca's hand. 2 lines written in hurried ink that Rebecca had read so many times she could recite them without unfolding the paper anymore. "He knows about the baby. He always knew. Ask Leonard why he really left." If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment right now that says, "I'm still here." Let's see who is truly following this story all the way through, because what is coming in the next 4 chapters is going to change everything you think you understand about Leonard, about this family, and about what that 9-year-old boy already knows. After Simone left, the compound settled into a new shape, smaller in some ways, quieter in others, but with its own particular gravity that held things together in the way that only necessity and love, working in combination, can hold things together over years and years of ordinary days. Rebecca and Daniel, 2 people in a house that had once held more and now held exactly enough. The routine built itself the way routines do when survival requires them, gradually and then completely until you cannot remember what the mornings looked like before they looked like this. Daniel up at 6:30. Uniform on the nail. Porridge on the table by 7. The walk to the school gate, Rebecca's hand around his smaller one, for blocks through the warming morning air. The market stall 3 mornings a week. The walk back at 3. Homework at the kitchen table. Dinner at 6. Bath, bed. Rebecca tucking the blanket to his chin with hands that were getting stiffer every year and would not admit it. This was their life. It was not a large life, but it was held together with the kind of care that makes small lives feel solid and real and worth something. Daniel started school the September after Simone left. He was the youngest and the quietest, and the teachers mentioned him to Rebecca at pickup not because he was difficult but because he was unusual. He listened so carefully, one teacher told her, in a tone that was both a compliment and slightly unnerving. He watches before he joins in, like he is figuring something out first. Rebecca said thank you and took his hand and walked him home and thought about Leonard. She thought about Leonard a great deal in those years. Not always painfully. Sometimes simply, the way you think about someone woven so deeply into how you understand your own life that removing them would leave something unrecognizable behind. She thought about him when Daniel laughed because the laugh came from somewhere that was not her and was not Simone. She thought about him when Daniel lined up his toy trucks along the windowsill in a precise and organized row and stood back with his hands on his hips to assess them with quiet satisfaction, because that was a gesture she had watched a younger Leonard perform with his school books at exactly that age. She had started the letter 4 times. For separate pieces of paper, for different openings, for attempts to find the right way into a truth that did not have a right way in. The most recent attempt had gotten 3 paragraphs before she folded it with the others in the envelope she kept under her Bible. She told herself she would finish it when she found the words. The words did not come. The envelope got thicker. The years continued. Daniel made one good friend at school. A boy named Joseph who was loud where Daniel was quiet, impulsive where Daniel was considered, and who seemed to find Daniel's watchfulness not strange but restful, the way energetic people sometimes find calm people restful without quite understanding why. They walked home together on Fridays. Joseph talked. Daniel listened and occasionally said one precise thing that made Joseph stop mid-sentence and actually think. Rebecca liked Joseph. She liked what his presence did to Daniel's face. But even with Joseph, even in his most unguarded moments, there was something Daniel kept behind his eyes. A room he did not take anyone into. Rebecca saw it and understood it because she had a room like that herself, and she knew exactly what it cost to maintain one across years and years of daily life. He was 7 the first time she caught him reaching for the top shelf. She came into the kitchen and found him standing on the chair on his toes, fingers just brushing the spine of the Bible. She said his name once, quietly. He climbed down without being asked and went back to the table and picked up his pencil and said nothing. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she went back to the hallway. She told herself the money transfer receipts meant nothing to a 7-year-old. She told herself he could not have understood what he saw, even if he had seen something. She had been telling herself things for so long that she had become, without quite meaning to, remarkably skilled at it. What she did not know was that Daniel had not just seen the receipts. He had copied the name from them into the back of his school notebook. In small careful letters, underlined twice, and beneath the name, in the handwriting of a child who watches everything and forgets nothing, he had written one question. Why does he send money but never come? Leonard's first year abroad was the kind of hard that either breaks a person or clarifies them completely. For Leonard, it clarified. He arrived with 2 bags, a contact's phone number written on a folded piece of paper, and the particular determination of a man who has told his mother he will be back in a year and has every intention of keeping that promise. The construction work was real. The hours were long in the way that leaves room for nothing except sleep and then more work, and Leonard threw himself into it with the focused energy of someone running toward something and simultaneously, though he would not have admitted it then, running away from something else. He did not think about Simone. He had made a decision about Simone and he kept it in the locked room where he kept decisions that were final. He did not take it out and examine it. This was something Leonard was exceptionally good at. Moving forward, keeping his eyes fixed on the direction he had chosen, not letting them drift toward what was behind him. He called Rebecca every Sunday that first year. Long calls, 40 minutes, sometimes more. He told her about the work, the money he was saving, the life he was building from whatever a man with nothing but his own capability could build. He sent money every month. Not large amounts at first, but consistent, because consistency was the promise he could keep even when the others began to slip. The first small business started in his 2nd year. A man he worked with knew someone who needed a renovation done quickly and cheaply. Leonard organized it, found the workers, priced the materials, managed the timeline, delivered the result 4 days early. The referrals came. Then more referrals. By the middle of his 3rd year, Leonard was no longer working for someone else. He had 3 crews working for him and more inquiries arriving than he could immediately absorb. The calls home started getting shorter. Not from cruelty, never from any reduction in love, but from the breathless compression of a life that had finally caught its momentum and was now moving faster than anything he had ever experienced. There was always something requiring his attention at the exact hour he had meant to call. He sent money every month without fail. The amounts grew steadily larger. He told himself his mother was fine. The money proved it. The steady calm of her voice proved it. He told himself he would visit soon. After this contract. Once this pressure eased. He told himself that for 9 years. The business stopped being small in year 5. What had begun with 3 crews had become something with a name on a building, contracts requiring lawyers to review, and 31 people whose livelihoods depended directly on Leonard's decisions. He bought the Mercedes. He bought the suit. He stood in front of a mirror in the shop and looked at himself for a long time and thought about his mother and about the look she would have on her face when she saw what he had become. He told himself he would go back soon and show her. He did not go back soon. Meanwhile, under Rebecca's bed, the envelope waited. 6 pages now. The creases gone soft from being folded and refolded too many times. the words still unsent. And in a school notebook in a 9-year-old boy's room, a question sat underlined in careful pencil, waiting for an answer that was finally, whether anyone was ready for it or not, 72 hours away, because Leonard had made a decision on the plane coming home. A decision that had nothing to do with gifts or prepared speeches or the return of a successful son. A decision about the truth he had been carrying in his own locked room for 9 years. The truth Simone had tried to tell him could not stay buried. The truth that had started, finally and without his permission, to find its own way into the light, through a 9-year-old boy with a name copied in careful pencil into the back of a school notebook and the patience to wait for exactly the right moment. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, the way things that change everything tend to arrive, without announcement, without the weight of the moment signaling itself in advance. On an ordinary day when Rebecca was at the sink rinsing the lunch dishes and Daniel was at the kitchen table working through his mathematics homework with the quiet focus he brought to everything he considered worth doing properly. The phone buzzed against the counter. She picked it up without looking at the name. Mama. She went very still. She would have recognized Leonard's voice in a crowded room with her eyes closed. What made her still was not the voice itself but what lived underneath it. Something open, something that had set down a weight she had not heard him put down in years. "I'm coming home," Leonard said, the dishcloth in her hand, the water still running in the sink. Daniel's pencil moving steadily across the page 2 feet away. "I've booked the flight," Leonard continued. "Friday the 14th. I land in the evening. Mama, it's done. Nothing is moving it this time. I am coming home." Rebecca turned off the tap. "The 14th, she said. Her voice came out level. She could not have explained how. "I have things I need to say to you," Leonard said, and his voice shifted slightly. Became more careful. The way a voice becomes careful when it is approaching the edge of something it has been rehearsing for a long time. "Things I should have said years ago. I cannot say them properly over a phone." "No," Rebecca said quietly. "You cannot." They spoke a few minutes more. She answered his questions and made the appropriate sounds and held herself completely together through the full length of the call. Then Leonard said goodbye and the screen went dark. She stood at the sink without moving. Then she looked at the photograph on the wall. The young man midwave, grinning at a future he was absolutely certain was going to be exactly what he imagined. Then she turned. Daniel was watching her. His pencil was down. His homework was forgotten. He was watching her with those large still eyes. His face carrying the careful neutrality of a child who has learned that asking directly does not always produce the complete truth. "Finish your work," Rebecca said. "I'll start dinner in a while." He held her gaze one moment longer than was comfortable. Then he picked up his pencil. Rebecca went to the bedroom and closed the door behind her. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dimness and pressed both hands flat against her thighs and breathed in and out, and in again. Then she reached under the bed, all the way to the wall, and her fingers found the envelope. She unfolded the letter in the thin light coming through the gap in the curtain, and she read every word she had written across 6 years of trying to find the right ones. "Leonard, my son. There is something I should have told you a long time ago, and I am sorry it has taken me this many years to find the words. 8 months after you left, a young woman named Simone came to this door. She was carrying a newborn baby boy. I looked at that child's face and I knew, the way I have always known things about you, that he was yours. I brought them inside. I have been raising the boy since he was 2 years old. When Simone left and did not come back. His name is Daniel. He is 9 years old. He is healthy and good and quiet in the way that reminds me of you at that age, though he has a steadiness that is entirely his own. He does not know who you are. I have not known how to tell him. I have not known how to tell you. I am finishing this letter now because I am tired. Leonard. Not of him, never of him. Tired of carrying the distance between the truth and the moment to speak it. There is something else. Something Simone told me the day she left, that I have not known what to do with for 7 years. She said you knew about the baby. She said you knew before you left. Rebecca's hands were not steady when she folded the letter. She sat in the dimness and she thought about the 14th. She thought about 3 weeks. She thought about a boy in the next room with a name copied in careful pencil and a question underlined twice. She made her decision. She was going to call Leonard back tonight. She was going to speak the words she had been folding and refolding for 6 years. She was going to stop letting the secret be the thing that held this family together in the place where the truth should be. She picked up the phone. Then she heard Daniel's voice through the door. Quiet, certain. The particular voice of a child who has been waiting for exactly the right moment and has decided, at last, that it has arrived. "Grandma," he said, "I need to show you something." A pause. The sound of a notebook opening. "I found his email address," Daniel said. "I wrote to him 3 weeks ago." He wrote back. "We have been writing to each other every week since then." Another pause, shorter. "He knows about me, Grandma. He told me he is coming. And he told me something else in his last message. Something about why he really left. Something I think you need to hear before he gets here." The phone in Rebecca's hand went completely dark. Because in that moment, with her heart pressing hard against her ribs and the 6-page letter folded in her lap and her grandson's steady voice coming through the door with the composure of a child who has been holding a truth of his own for 3 weeks, Rebecca understood that she was not the only one in this house who had been keeping a secret. The secret Daniel was holding was not hers. It was Leonard's, and it was already 4 days from walking through the door. The dust road looked exactly the way Leonard remembered it and nothing like it at all. He had been awake for most of the 14-hour flight. Not from anxiety, or not only from anxiety, but from the particular alertness that settles over a person when something they have been moving toward for a very long time is finally close enough to feel. He had watched the city come into view through the oval window and felt something in his chest shift in a way that had nothing to do with business or success or the 31 people whose names were in his phone and whose livelihoods depended on his judgment. It had to do with a dust road. Compound. A woman who had been standing still while he moved and moving while he stood still, for 9 years without complaint. He had arranged the car at the airport black, quiet, the kind of vehicle that reflected 9 years of distance between who he had been and who he had become, and given the driver the address from memory because that address had never left him, not for a single day of the 9 years he had spent not returning to it. And now the car was on the dust road and Leonard was sitting in the back seat in his suit with his hands in his lap that were not, if he was honest, entirely still. He needed to be honest with himself about what he was carrying into this moment. Not just the gift in the bag on the seat beside him. Not just the prepared words, the rehearsed apologies, the 9 years of accumulated guilt he had been meaning to repay. He was also carrying a truth. His own truth, the one that had lived in the locked room for 9 years, the one Simone had known, the one a 9-year-old boy had somehow located and held quietly and with extraordinary patience until the moment was right. The car stopped. Leonard sat for a moment that was slightly longer than necessary. Then he opened the door and stepped out into the late afternoon heat of the compound and the smell of the place. Dust and wood smoke and something cooking low on a flame hit him with the full physical force of everything he had spent 9 years telling himself he would come back to and then not coming back to. He straightened his jacket. He looked at the house. The roof had a new patch on the left side. The blue canopy was folded against the wall. Everything was smaller than memory had kept it and more real than anything he had looked at in 9 years. He walked to the door slowly because he understood, more clearly than he had understood anything in a long time, that some moments deserve to be entered with the full weight of what they are. He raised his hand to knock. The door opened before his knuckles could land. Rebecca stood in the frame. Leonard had told himself he was prepared for the sight of her. 9 years older, the lines deeper, the body slightly smaller. What he had not told himself, because there was no way to prepare for it, was her expression. It was not surprise. It was not the joy he had spent 9 years imagining receiving. It was something far more complex and far more costly. The face of a woman who has been simultaneously dreading and longing for a specific moment for 9 years and who is now standing inside that moment and finding it exactly as enormous and as irreversible as she always feared it would be. His mouth opened to say her name, and then his eyes moved, because pressed against Rebecca's side, one small hand curled into the fabric of her dress. Holding on with the quiet grip of a child who is standing his ground, was a boy, 9 years old, slight but straight-backed, composed with a composure that did not belong to childhood, the composure of someone who has taught himself to be steady because the adults around him needed something solid to stand near. He was looking up at Leonard. His eyes were large and still and patient, and they held an expression that was not fear and was not shyness and was not the blank curiosity of a child meeting a stranger. It was recognition. Leonard looked at those eyes. And the world, the entire constructed, accumulated, hard-won world of 9 years, stopped. He had known, in the way the mind knows things when it has been given information, that a boy existed. Daniel's emails had told him. He had read every one of them across 3 weeks, and he had written back, and he had believed, in the intellectual part of himself that managed difficult information, that he was prepared. He had told himself on the plane that he knew what was waiting. He had told himself he was ready for this moment. He was not ready. He was not remotely, in any part of himself that mattered, ready. Because there is a distance, an enormous, uncrossable, permanent distance, between knowing a child exists somewhere in the world and standing 3 feet from a boy who has your own eyes looking back at you from another face. Between understanding intellectually that blood is shared and feeling it land in your body like something physical, like a door swinging open inside your chest that you did not know was there and that will never, you understand in that instant, ever close again. Leonard looked at his son. His son looked back at him. And everything Leonard had built across 9 years, the company, the contracts, the Mercedes on the dust road behind him, the suit, the watch, the carefully constructed life of a man who had made himself into something from nothing. All of it became, in the space of that one breath, the least important thing about him. The thing that mattered. The thing that had always mattered. The thing that had been standing in this doorway in a school shirt with its laces done in a double knot, waiting, with more patience than most adults ever locate in themselves. For him to come home and see it, was here, was real, was looking up at him with eyes that were unmistakably, undeniably, devastatingly his own. Leonard's breath left him in a way that had nothing to do with the heat. His throat closed. His chest pressed inward. Something moved across his face that he had no ability in that moment to control or compose or redirect. 9 years of distance and absence and locked rooms and the truth he had been carrying, all of it arriving at once. Not as thought but as physical sensation, as the specific grief of a man who is understanding in real time and all at once exactly what he missed and exactly what survived his missing of it and finding, to his profound and permanent undoing, that those are the same thing. His hand came up to his mouth briefly. He pressed it there. He breathed. Rebecca's hand moved slowly to the boy's shoulder. Nobody spoke. The dust settled around Leonard's shoes. The late light held its angle across the compound. The wood smoke drifted. Somewhere in the distance a radio was playing something low and indistinct. And then Daniel, 9 years old, steady as the ground he was standing on, looked up at the man in the suit with the Mercedes behind him and the hand pressed to his mouth and the 9 years of absence written plainly across his face. And he did what he had been quietly preparing to do for 3 weeks. He reached into the school notebook open in his hand and removed a folded piece of paper. Not a page from the notebook. Something older. Something that had been folded and refolded until the creases had gone completely soft and the paper had taken on the particular texture of something that has been handled by someone who needed, many times over many years, to hold the thing it said. He held it out toward Leonard. "I found this in Grandma's Bible 2 years ago," Daniel said. His voice did not waver. Not even slightly. "I read it. I know what Simone wrote. I know what it says about what you knew before you left." He paused, letting that land completely. "But there is still a part of the story that is missing. And I think you are the only person who can tell it." He glanced up at Rebecca, whose face had gone very still in the particular way of someone who has just discovered that the child they were protecting has been, quietly and without drama, protecting them right back. Then Daniel looked at Leonard again. "Not to me," Daniel said. "To her." Leonard looked at the paper in his son's hand. He looked at his mother's face, the shock moving through it in slow waves as she understood that Daniel had known for 2 years, that this boy had been carrying Simone's note and his own questions and the weight of the family's unsaid things with the extraordinary, devastating patience of a 9-year-old who somehow understood that the truth needed a witness and had decided, in his quiet and unhurried way, to wait until all 3 of them were in the same place before he produced it. Leonard looked at his son for a long moment. At those eyes. At the steadiness in them. at the notebook in his hands and the double-knotted laces on his shoes and the way he stood straight-backed, calm, present, in the doorway of the small house on the dust road that Rebecca Carter had held together alone for 9 years. Then Leonard reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He removed his own envelope, sealed, prepared on the plane, addressed in his own handwriting, because he had known from Daniel's final email that managed reveals were finished and the time for complete and unguarded truth had finally, irrevocably arrived. He held it out to Rebecca. "There are things I should have told you before I left," Leonard said. His voice was not entirely steady and he did not try to make it so. "About Simone. About why I really left. About what I knew before I got on that plane and what I have been living with every morning since." He paused. "I am not the only one in this family who has been carrying a secret, Mama. I know that now. I think we have all been carrying pieces of the same truth in separate rooms for long enough." He looked at Daniel, at his son. "It is time to stop holding it separately and start holding it together. All of it. Today." Rebecca looked at the envelope in her son's hand. She looked at her grandson, standing between them in the last of the afternoon light with Simone's folded note extended and his eyes clear and patient and without accusation. A child who had wanted not to cause damage but to build something, who had found a name on a receipt and followed it all the way to this doorway and had been wise enough and brave enough to wait until the moment was right to speak. And then, for the first time in 9 years, Rebecca Carter's composure came apart. Not loudly, not dramatically. The way things come apart when they have been held under immense pressure for a very long time and the hands finally, at last, open. Quietly, completely, and with the particular relief of a woman who has been carrying something enormous alone in the dark for so long that setting it down in the light feels less like loss and more like the first real breath in 9 years. Leonard stepped forward. He put his arms around his mother and held her the way he had held her 9 years ago at the same door, long, and without sound, pressing his hand flat against her back the way she had pressed her hand against his when he was small and something had frightened him. He felt her shoulders shake once, briefly, and then go still in the way of a woman who has spent 65 years learning to compose herself and is still, even now, choosing dignity. After a moment, a small hand pressed against Leonard's arm. He looked down. Daniel had moved close. He was not hugging anyone. He was not crying. He was standing beside his grandmother with his hand resting lightly on Leonard's arm and his eyes looking up with an expression that was not yet love. Love takes time, and Daniel knew that, and he was patient enough to know it. But that was something adjacent to it. Something that had been growing quietly for 3 weeks of emails and 2 years of a folded note in a Bible and 9 years of a name on a receipt and a photograph on the wall and a question underlined twice in the back of a school notebook. Something that was the beginning of what comes after secrets end. Leonard looked at his son. His son looked back. The dust road was quiet behind them. The light was fading now, the compound moving into the soft amber of early evening. In the kitchen behind Rebecca, something was still cooking low on the flame, patient and unhurried, filling the small house with warmth. Leonard Carter had come home a billionaire. He had come with a gift in a bag and a speech rehearsed for 9 years and a plan for how the moment would go. The moment had gone its own way entirely, the way moments do when they have been held in waiting long enough to develop a gravity of their own. And standing in the doorway of his mother's worn and weathered house, with the dust settling around his shoes and his mother in his arms and his son beside him and the truth finally in the open air between all three of them, Leonard understood something that 9 years of building and accumulating and becoming had not been able to teach him. He had spent 9 years making himself into something. He had always already been something. He had been a son. He had been a father. He had been the man in the photograph on the wall that a 9-year-old boy had looked at every morning of his life and felt something he could not name. Something between familiar and far away. Something that was, it turned out, exactly what it felt like to recognize the face of the person you came from before anyone has told you who that person is. That was worth more than everything the Mercedes represented. That was worth more than all of it. And all three of them, the woman who had held everything together, the man who had finally come back, and the boy who had been patient enough to wait for the truth to have its moment, stepped back from the door and went inside. Together. For the first time, and at last. Friends, if this story moved something in you today, If it reminded you of the cost of silence and the extraordinary courage it takes to finally speak the truth and stand inside it. Please leave a comment below right now and tell us what you felt in that doorway moment. Was it Rebecca who broke your heart? Or Daniel who amazed you? Or Leonard standing there finally seeing his son for the first time? Tell us. And please share this video with someone today. A friend? A sister? Someone who needs to be reminded that families can survive secrets if love is large enough and someone is brave enough to begin. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already, because there are more stories like this one coming. Stories about sacrifice and silence and the things we carry alone and the moment we finally choose to set them down. We will see you in the next one.